This is a new voice for a new Scotland.
Hi, my name's Ken Bates, and thank you for joining me for my conversations. This time round, I'm talking with Peter Rowberry, an English Scot. And I began by asking Peter about life before coming to Scotland.
Before we moved to Scotland, we were living in Suffolk, but Suffolk isn't my born county. I'm originally from the Birmingham. We called Birmingham the dead centre of England when I was there, dead. But that's not that's very unfair because it's an underestimated part of England because it's very influential during the Industrial Revolution. As I was growing up, Birmingham was becoming a very multicultural city. I was born in 1951, and that was the start of the immigration from the Caribbean, the Windrush generation. And Birmingham had a lot of West Indians and Caribbean people settling there. It made for a very lively atmosphere in the area, and in some ways influenced my my belief system all the way through my life. And so Suffolk came after a couple of moves. My parents moved down to the New Forest. I followed them and then went to London for college. Then after college, I went to live in Brighton. Brighton I could afford to buy a flat in, which I could never do in London. It meant a 60-mile commute into London every day, but that was a big part of my social life, actually. Sounds very sad, really, but we all caught the 747 train, and so we were known as the 747 Club, and we got together at weekends, and that was Brighton's a really lively place, and certainly a great city for young people. And I met my wife Susan there, so Brighton has have a lot to be thankful for Brighton for. I must say it took me 45 years to find her, so but we met and we got on really well. We were like minds on almost all issues, so we decided to get married. We both had flats in Brighton and wanted to own the ground underneath our property, and that's why we moved to Suffolk. We bought a place in Saxmundham, a market town in the Suffolk area towards the coast, and that's where we lived for 16 years.
So what made you decide to come to Scotland?
There were many factors. I cannot deny that economics was one of them. We had an expensive house in Suffolk, but because we met late in life, we had quite a large mortgage, and we could move to Scotland and reduce the value of our mortgage. So that was an important factor, but much more important, we were seeing a change in the attitudes and culture in the area of rural Suffolk. People were getting much more insular, quite honestly, blatantly nationalist feelings. It was always a strong community identity in that kind of rural environment, and was very small c and actually large c conservative. And I was seeing a lot of changes of people being resentful of people coming into Suffolk from outside. Now that included us. We were being there long enough to people to get to know us, but there are a lot of people moving out from Essex and into the area, a huge amount of house building going on, and that was meant the atmosphere in the place was changing. I didn't feel really comfortable there like I did when we first moved there. In addition to that, we of course had a little referendum about leaving the European Union. I'm a massive Europhile. I strongly believe that we are stronger as part of a European Union. The irony of that is that people who were in the better together camp in the United Kingdom, saying the United Kingdom is better off as one country. I use that to say, well, you want to be part of Europe, but you don't want to be part of the United Kingdom. And I think there are some very good reasons for that. But clearly the idea of leaving the EU was embarrassing to me. My background includes the fact that my grandfather came from Strasbourg, originally when it was a German area, province. He was born as a German. He came over to England when he was 14. After being abused at work, he ran away from home, basically, because they said he had to carry on with his apprenticeship. And he came over, married my grandmother, who was a Londoner, and my mum's a Londoner. And I always felt that what we were saying about Europe was in actual fact another example of nationalism and isolationism as well, to say that we can do better by ourselves. But if you look at it, I think quite clearly the countries that are doing well are working cooperatively, not individually. So the thought of leaving the EU was catastrophic, and we did think of moving to Europe, but we did have ties to the UK. While my mother was alive, she was suffering dementia. My brother was looking after her. I felt that I couldn't just leave the UK and leave him with that responsibility without any help from me.
Yeah. Did you choose the part of Scotland that you live in? Did you choose that because it was still near to England, or is it the area that you particularly like?
Well, I did like the area. We still have relatives right down on the south coast, in Arundel and in West Suffolk. We didn't want to go too far up into the Highlands, and the Borders area has a lot of cultural significance for England and English people, and it did seem very, very comfortable for us. I also knew Scotland slightly from visits to Edinburgh, both with a drama group that I was part of, but individually as visits as tourists to Edinburgh. And we thought, well, where is it that's close enough to a city like Edinburgh that has the rural and small town feel that we actually got used to in Suffolk?
Yeah. What were your first impressions of Scotland when you actually moved here? I mean, obviously buying property here is slightly different than it is down south. You sort of put bids on a property here as well. And obviously, what were other first impressions of the country when you first came here to live?
Well, I looked into the issue of the property market quite carefully, and my feeling was that the Scottish system actually offered some significant advantages over the English system. It's not all black and white. There are advantages to the selling system that's in England. But clearly the Scottish idea of once you make an offer, that's a contractual commitment and you pay penalties if you don't go through to completion. That is something that could well be adopted in England, and I'm not sure why the Law Society have risen up against it, quite honestly. The other thing is that we did come up on reconnaissance visits. We didn't come up in blind. We stayed in a lovely place in Earlston, bed and breakfast for 2 visits. They were from South Africa, the owners of the place, amazingly enough, and we talked a lot about why we both were looking to move to Scotland. One of the things that I found instantly was the sheer friendliness and openness of people that we were meeting in Scotland. That made me feel comfortable that the decision to move out of Suffolk was the right one. After those reconnaissance visits, we decided not to burn our bridges straight away. We were quite comfortable, but we then said, we'll have a rental. We'll take a 6-month lease, which is sort of normal lease length for Scotland, and we'll think about it before we finally, as I say, burn our bridges and decide we will not go back, because realistically, the fact that we've got a cheaper property up here will make it very difficult to move back into the Suffolk area in particular. in Moorbattle was quite a surprise. We moved into a rental called Caddy Cottage in Teapot Lane in Moorbattle, very quaintly named. The neighbours there were fantastic. The first thing we heard were greetings from the neighbours saying, if there's anything you need, you know about the area, what shall we do, and what can we do for you? They were brilliant, and we still keep in touch with them, especially the Bells, who lived opposite us, and they're still very good friends. And we said we had to stay for 3 months at least, because if you don't stay for 3 months on your lease, then you potentially get stung for extra council tax. And so we said we'll stay for 3 months and then make up our minds. Well, actually, it only took us 48 hours. We said we are going to stay. We'll go through to the end of our lease period, but in that time we can start looking for the properties in the borders.
So you found Scotland's definitely a very welcoming country. You never sort of faced any issues because you were English. You never encountered any problems with that at all?
There's been just one or two minor incidents, and I can say that those are rather trivial, you know. But as an English person, when growing up, you got pummeled with Scottish jokes whenever you went to school. You know, you've heard them all. I won't bother. Most of them are rude, so I won't repeat them. But I lived in a little road in Erdington in Birmingham. One of my best friend at school was a guy called Craig Miller. You can probably tell from the name where he came from. He'd moved down, his dad had moved down to work in Birmingham, but they were true Scots, and they always were strongly advocating their Scottish heritage. So I was born with a little bit of Scottish indoctrination, if you like, down in England. And that countered the rather dreary racist kind of comments people had about deep fried Mars bars and meanness and nastiness of Scottish.
Unfortunately, we still see that in some cases down south. I mean, when I first moved up here and I went down there, and I learned so much when I first came to Scotland. I started learning a bit about Scottish history. But I remember in England, you know, it seems to be this common misconception that Scotland is somehow subsidised by the Westminster government, and that's like a common belief. I mean, did you think those sort of things before you moved here?
I believe that I was open-minded enough to treat those things with a large spoonful of salt, hardly a pinch. But yes, I didn't know much about the politics of Scotland. My interest politically was what was going on in the direct area and the influence of Westminster. And I suppose I didn't know enough to be critical of those issues. It was only when people started quoting the Barnett formula as an excuse for saying Scotland are sponging off the Westminster government that I started looking into it and finding, as you well know, Ken, that actually the reverse is true, that Scotland is the only part of the United Kingdom with a significant surplus on its balance of trade. Well, Wales, I believe, has a slight surplus, but we've got a great trade surplus. We've got the best resources, the best water, best renewable energy resources, which was another reason for thinking about moving to Scotland, actually. You may be aware of Saxmundham being very close to the Suffolk coast, and 6 miles away from the Sizewell B power station. And they, of course, were, both Labour and the Conservative government were keen to build new nuclear power stations. And my scientific mind looked into that, and I thought, this is both unnecessary, expensive, and pollution-wise quite dangerous. So I was campaigning to stop the expansion of nuclear power in in Suffolk, the building of Sizewell C. And it's not a surprise to me that many years on from the plans first being put forward, that there isn't any real work going on Sizewell C, and we were a long way off even finishing the first tranche of new nuclear power in Hinkley. And thank goodness, Scotland doesn't need it. I have been lucky enough to have conversation with Paul Wheelhouse, the Energy Secretary in the Scottish Government, and exchanged views on that. And he said, and he shares that view that we don't need nuclear power. We've got some brilliant renewable energy projects that are going on. So I feel safer that there aren't new nuclear being built in Scotland.
How do you talk? We're talking sort of, we've gone into politics in that respect. Obviously, you know, I myself, as you know, was into politics some years ago. Still into politics in many ways now. But how do you find? Do you watch proceedings at Holyrood? How do you find that different, Scottish politics from politics in Westminster?
Gobsmacked I was. I was absolutely amazed. I'd also seen, as well as before we came to Scotland, I was keen on European issues. I've still got relations all over Europe, France, Spain and Belgium. So I had watched proceedings in the European Parliament as well, and contrast those with the bear pit politics in Westminster, the yelling and interruptions, the kind of politics which has gone from being the logical, evidence-based politics that when I was a public servant, I was working with and on, you know, our policy documents and that we put forward had to show what the evidence base was. And that seemed to go out of the window after the years of Thatcher, even worse now. The Westminster, as I said, was a bear pit. It wasn't politics. It wasn't a responsible debate. So when I saw Holyrood, I looked back and said, I can listen to this. I don't have to say, "Oh, shut up and let her speak," or "let him speak," as we did in Westminster.
Yes, yeah, I agree. I agree. Yeah, I think it is. There is still a little bit of jeering and all that, but nowhere near the sort of levels that you see at Westminster. I mean, when I first came, I remember exactly the same as yourself. I couldn't believe it. You know, I'd never seen anything of Holyrood when I was living down south because, well, they don't really televise Holyrood down south at all. You know, so
no.
It was a big surprise. So we have to talk about, were you independence? Obviously, an important topic.
Yeah.
Were you a supporter of Scottish independence when you first came to Scotland?
Almost straight away, and perhaps a little bit before that, because, as I said, my biggest issue in politics in England, and I still think it's the biggest issue in spite of COVID-19, and that is our relationships with the rest of the world and our relationships with Europe in particular, and the state of the UK as a trading nation. I think that once the referendum did the disastrous thing of voting on emotional and unsubstantiated beliefs about Europe and all the talk about bent bananas and sailors having to wear hard hats and all those kind of nonsense which have been played up in the English media. Now there's a topic for you, the English media. Maybe we'll come back to that. Yeah. Well, those were played up by all those things and people said, oh, well, we're far better off running our own affairs. Well, you can't just divorce yourself from the rest of the planet, as we have found out over the last 4 months.
Yeah, it is, especially the last 4 months. And you can we look at the leadership shown by Nicola Sturgeon. You compare that with Boris down south. it's completely different. And what are your thoughts on the way that the government have handled this whole COVID-19 pandemic in Scotland?
Well, it starts off several years ago. The current Prime Minister has been proven to lie over a number of issues. I won't pull my punches. A High Court judge says, you lied to the Queen, but you're a politician, so we shouldn't expect you to lie. I personally think that's a disgusting place to be. And he's been sacked as Foreign Secretary. He's even today we're hearing about his affairs as Lord Mayor of London in building scandals and his pressure to get building consents through for people in his favourite cadre. The whole business of undermining one of the principles of government in a democracy, that's the division of power between the administration and the executive. Are you leaving the civil service to give advice and support that advice and to administer the policy when that advice contains things that the dynamic duo, the not so dynamic duo of Cummings and Johnson actually disagree with, they get rid of them. And we've seen that with the scientists on the SAGE committee, the emergency committee. People have just not been prepared to stay up with that if their advice is routinely ignored. So we have an independent committee talking about the COVID emergency because they're not getting their say in through to the powers that be. And I don't think Cummings and Johnson have the right credentials to make the scientific judgments. And they've made some really, really big mistakes. They went into lockdown too late. They didn't join in a European procurement for protective equipment, ventilators, etc., which meant they were slow getting those. And there's still problems of supply of PPE in England, which we don't have in Scotland. The whole issue of COVID, it has been said that there are a significant number of deaths that are caused by the inaction of the Johnson government. That if the Johnson government had implemented lockdown 1 week earlier, that could possibly have saved 20,000 lives. And that's an independent scientist saying that. Not a Labour Party politician.
Yeah, I've noticed that, especially down south, a lot of people, my friends who live in England, have been, instead of using stupid names and calling Nicola Sturgeon stupid names, they're actually now realising that the leadership that we've had here and the way that our First Minister has led the country through COVID-19. Okay, we're a few weeks behind, but I mean, as we talk this afternoon, there was 9 deaths, I think, has been reported. That obviously includes figures sometimes from over the weekend. We've had 4 days of none, but of course down south have had far more. And I think from that, we're seeing now, leading into talking about independence for Scotland, I think at the last poll, I think it was 54% of people would vote for independence for Scotland. What are your thoughts on IndyRef 2 and independence for Scotland? Obviously, you came here to kind of hopefully escape from Brexit, which is still going to happen. Scotland is still being dragged out against its will. Obviously, you're a big supporter of independence for Scotland.
I actually am very much a supporter. I would go back to something that was in the newspapers today, that in actual fact, English people want to have English independence as well. I think it was a 46% vote for in England for English people having their own independence, because for them, they still think Scotland's a drain on their resources. Yeah, and so I see the figures for bearing in mind that these are opinion polls and there's always a degree of inaccuracy, but 56% of Scottish people want independence. Now, I'm seeing a couple of things here. We are in quite a conservative area in the borders, as you know. The three constituencies along the English border are all held by Conservative MPs. But I'm seeing people who are saying, I won't vote for Nicola Sturgeon, but I believe that she's done a very good job. I don't see the link between that, because if she's doing a good job, why not vote for her? The other side of it is friends in England. I still have friends in England, in spite of pummeling on at them about the politics in Scotland and saying how wonderful Scotland is all the time. Well, not all the time.
Same myself. I do it all the time.
So they do get a bit teed off with me about that side of things, but I see let me start again. I see that there are conservative liberals who are saying we must much rather have Nicola Sturgeon than Boris Johnson. We have much more faith in the way she's doing business. And as you say about the conduct in Parliament, that there is always a much friendlier and understandable debate in Parliament. The briefings, the other thing about daily briefings, in Scotland, I felt that the outstanding thing that Nicola Sturgeon did was to be absolutely clear about what she expected citizens in Scotland to do. And Boris Johnson has been as clear as mud over things. Is it 1 metre or 2 metres? Are schools going back or not? Will we have local lockdown or not? The result of that has been that there's been this very long tail, if not a second spike. There's been a very long tail to the COVID crisis in England. Now, there might be sort of demographic and geographical reasons why that's the case. But we have our big cities. We have Glasgow and Edinburgh. When we may not be as big as London, but to be honest with you, I think the people in Glasgow and Edinburgh are obeying the social distancing rules much better. And even though the lockdown is carrying on a bit longer in Scotland, people in Scotland are tolerating that because they see that the advice is clear and it's based upon science. It's not based upon politics.
Mm-hmm. But when we were, just as we talk today, of course, there's been quite a lot of talk, and I've seen a number of people are saying that because of how we're seeing so few deaths here and a lot more down south in England and the other parts of the UK, Northern Ireland and Wales are not seeing big numbers of deaths. Do you think that, do you agree with some of these people that think that that the border should be closed except for essential travel between the countries?
I have a big problem with this. I don't believe in closing the border unless it's absolutely essential. But on the other hand, the alternative to closing the border is to say to people coming into Scotland from England that you must self-isolate and quarantine yourself for a period of 14 days. Now, I'll be honest with you, I saw the mass gatherings in Bournemouth early in the COVID crisis, the same in Green Park in London, where people were blatantly ignoring the social distancing rule. Bournemouth was a disgrace, not just because of social distancing, because of the amount of rubbish that was left on the beach. It was disgraceful in itself. So I am not 100%. My instinct would be to keep the border open until the first incident where somebody has come over with symptoms. I also think that we missed the trick scientifically in the test, trace, isolate regime. We did in the UK as a whole we left our border open for a long time without any test and trace at the port of entry, and we're still not doing test and trace at the port of entry. Everybody's saying how difficult it will be, but let me put it this way: I'm no scientist, but surely it takes no more than a few seconds to test somebody's body temperature. Put a thermometer in their mouth and test their body temperature, and only then, if they're showing signs of raised temperature, do you have to go through the chemical biological test to test whether somebody's antibody positive or virus positive for COVID. That is, and we haven't done that. We are an island. We had the biggest advantage of any country in Europe being an island. Only internal borders. Now look at New Zealand, an island, similar kind of culture that we have here in the UK. They trace people at the airports, and in the whole of the epidemic, they've now only had 22 deaths. Now, we as an island lost that advantage by talking nonsense about this is only a minor flu epidemic and we can let it run its course and it will burn itself out. The Cummings herd immunity statement that he so vigorously denies saying, but nobody said he denied. I don't think he's ever denied saying that the country could do with a few less pensioners. And as a pensioner myself, I take rather strong objection to that fact, because I still pay into this system with my taxes from my occupational pension, and I'm not a worthless person. And I've been treated like a worthless person by Dominic Cummings.
Mm. Go back to the independence thing. Obviously, the biggest thing at the moment, obviously, COVID-19 has put that to one side for some time. And of course, we've got the UK government of Westminster who are refusing to grant the Section 30 order, which would allow there to be a referendum. What are your thoughts on the fact that the UK government seems to be desperate to cling on to Scotland, yet puts it down, and everyone seems to think that Scotland's sponging off the UK government all the time? It's a bit of a quandary. How do you think the Scottish government should maybe proceed if it's not going to be granted a Section 30 order?
I think there's a relatively simple answer to that, and it's what people have been calling the Plan B. And the Plan B is there will be, hopefully, a fully and open election in 2021 without restrictions on voting or anything like that. And that will be our Scottish referendum. As far as I'm concerned, if independence supporting parties win a significant majority in the Scottish Parliament, we will have to go forward and say you have no right to refuse. I can't remember all the legislative background to this, but I'm not a lawyer or a barrister, but I understand there is in statute the fact that the government of Westminster cannot proceed with legislation which is seen in Scotland to be against its best interests. Now, one can say there have been a number of legislative practices from the English Parliament that haven't been in Scotland's best interest recently, but surely this is one that the Westminster government cannot ignore. I think the other side of this is what happens in Westminster itself. You know, I'm a citizen of the world. I really need to think about what's happening in Westminster, and what will happen post 1st of January next year could well be quite dramatic. We're already hearing the Westminster government say it won't be able to implement proper border controls on the 1st of January. What will that mean? That will be that we will have mass smuggling illegal immigration across our borders, all of those things that the people who voted to be out of Europe, in actual fact, were complaining about. You know, the Brexit scenario will come just a few months before an election. We won't have a deal with America that satisfies the British people, because the British people have made it quite clear that they do not want the kind of animal welfare regimes that are in place in America. Routine use of antibiotics as growth promoters, genetically modified foods, chlorinated meat, all of those things are anathema to English people, and are basically only necessary in America to maximize profit, and in the case of chlorinated chickens, to remove the bacteria that would otherwise be dangerous to human health because of the welfare standards of their poultry production systems.
Mm.
Now, we have got in Europe and in the UK some of the highest welfare standards in the world. And the answer to that is not we should throw away those welfare standards in order to trade with America. We should say to America, in order to trade with us, you've got to live by our welfare standards. It's part of a global view, actually, about trade and welfare and animal welfare and wildlife support. These things are international issues. They're not for one country to dictate to the other. And I'm hoping that post-COVID we will go into a world where countries are much more able to cooperate with each other rather than fight these diplomatic fights that seem to go on forever.
What about an independent Scotland? Let's say, if hopefully next year we'll have the Holyrood elections. It'll be a majority independent supporting parties that will win. I know that there are candidates and a lot of these new little independent political parties, independent supporting political parties seem to be cropping up and popping up at the moment. Whether they'll get to be list MSPs or actual MSPs, fully elected MSPs, it'd be interesting to see. I think, what are your thoughts on how Scotland, do you think it would be problematic? Will Scotland see financial issues within independence once it becomes independent, or as a country, will it thrive?
I shouldn't take long to answer that question, should I? I have absolutely no doubt that Scotland is in a far better position than England to survive and economically grow post-Brexit. Now, a lot of our businesses have been severely trashed by the impact of COVID, by not being able to trade, by not being able to work. And that will be a major dilemma. And we're seeing the words from Boris Johnson about build, 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 but we still haven't seen the money coming out of that. Now, it strikes me as odd because I believe that economics are quite simple. If you need more money, you can actually print it. You could actually print from the Bank of England. You can use money and introduce money into the economy, which is what they've already done. They've loaned, or maybe at very low interest rates, 0.2% or so, maybe 0.6% at the most, £40 billion to large companies in the UK in order to get over that crisis. Now, I've asked the question about how much of that money is going to companies registered and working in Scotland, because I believe that we need that money in Scotland too. Now, the economics of that are difficult to understand. Everybody seems to think, like Margaret Thatcher, you've got your money in your purse and you can only spend what you've got in your purse. And that's just not true of macroeconomics on a national or international scale. Our only problem was we introduced large amounts of, they call it quantitative easing, don't they? Large amounts of money into the economy in order to improve the economy that would have inflationary impacts. But at the moment, our inflation rate is minute, and so that doesn't seem to be a problem. Now, the other side of it is that you almost certainly be aware of the work of Business for Scotland and their work on demonstrating that Scotland is not the poor man of the United Kingdom. It's got massive resources available to it. It is not just an oil-based economy. We're going out of that now anyway, but we've got hydroelectric, we've got water resources, we've got the benefit of some of the best engineers and technicians in the UK here in Scotland. We have an attitude of welcome to people from outside Scotland, which I think is very critical, which will enable us to exchange ideas and science with all the people around Europe in particular. You know, we're in danger of losing the kind of student exchange programs that have benefited Scotland and Scottish students so much. All of those things need to be encouraged and developed, and it's not just throwing money at it, it's an attitude. The attitude is that the attitude in England is that we're sending qualified doctors and qualified nurses home out of England because we don't want them here because they are foreigners. The immigration policy in the UK wide that is imposed upon us in Scotland is dangerous. It sets all the wrong ideas. And we're in danger of encouraging a racist tone, which is beginning to show itself even up here in Scotland.
Yeah, I mean, I've found Scotland to be a very outward-looking, because there's a big thing as well, isn't there? When we talk about Scotland, we mentioned earlier when we started talking about the nationalist attitude down in Saxmundham that was being there, and then you've got up here in Scotland, we talk about nationalists in Scotland, and it's a completely different thing, isn't it?
Well, it's also
not British nationalism, but Scottish nationalism is a lot more outward-looking, and it's inclusive. It's not the same, is it? It's a different kind of thing, but people seem to label nationalism as being exactly the same right-wing attitude that we see down you get in England as to that in Scotland.
I take your point completely there. What I would say, though, what I say to people who mimic that nationalism and say, well, it's the Scottish Nationalist Party's fault, isn't it? They're nationalists. Why, if they're nationalists, why can't we be nationalists? And of course, you know as well as I do that it's not a nationalist party, it's a national party. And there is the great big difference, a huge difference between pride in your country and pride in your achievements. And it is true that because of the openness, you have we're a tenth of the population of England in Scotland, roughly speaking, but we have a large proportion of the wonderful engineering achievements that have been undertaken in this country have been from Scottish engineers. They've got an intellectual base. Our universities have always been accepting of students from outside the UK, and as a result, this exchange of cultures, which helps get advances in science and technology, etc. That's Scotland. And to me, it's an absolute anathema to think of a country which doesn't have those characteristics. And yet there is one just south of our border.
That was Peter Rowberry there, talking to me a few weeks ago.
This is a new voice for a new Scotland.
That's all for this week. To keep up to date with all the happenings on the show, why not follow the Facebook page at facebook.com/Ken Bates Conversations. Until next time, stay safe